by Leadership Books. In just a moment, our host, Joseph Baker, will be joining us, along with a very special guest. Before we get started, I would like to introduce you to Joseph. He's a podcaster, event producer, writer, speaker, and audience builder. His passion is to help authors, speakers, and entrepreneurs build their audiences to monetize their leadership. Won't you please welcome our host, Joseph Baker.
Well, welcome everyone to the Compendium Podcast hosted by Leadership Books. I am here today with AJ Lactaoen. AJ is the founder and president of 911 Seminars / Safety Management Resources, a training company focused on working with schools and churches to improve emergency preparedness. SMR has trained thousands of teachers, administrators, students, and parents in bullying, active shooter protocol, natural disaster evacuation, the bird flu pandemic, and even a nuclear threat response. His books include A Gift More Precious Than Gold, 911, the Red Book for Emergencies, Active Shooter Threat in Our Schools, and the series, Who is the Biggest Bully of All? AJ, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Welcome today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me, Joseph. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And because we were chatting a little bit before the recording, tell us where you are and also where you're from.
Well, I'm originally born in Honolulu and lived most of my undergraduate years here, but then decided to go to Minnesota, University of Minnesota, for my graduate degrees. And lucky for me, I ended up marrying a beautiful Minnesota girl. And we relocated back in Hawaii after raising our two sons in Minnesota. But we're glad to be back home.
That's awesome. Well, I have to ask, were you absolutely freezing when you moved to Minnesota in the winter?
It's a funny story because we lived in northern Minnesota where it really gets cold. And our two boys actually loved the winter. We did all the winter things. We did the skiing, the ice fishing, snowmobiling. And my wife was a Minnesota girl, actually hated it. She always wanted to come back to Hawaii and live. And so finally we did. And so she was happy about it. And we still miss the snow sometimes.
Yes. You always want what you don't have. That seems to be, the way that it is.
Yeah.
So as I was preparing for today's episode, I was intrigued by some of the work that you do. I do have some experience working with organizations like yours that do emergency preparedness and so on and so forth. So tell us a little bit about that work first and foremost, and then we'll talk a little bit about your book.
Okay, wonderful. As I mentioned to you before, we lived on the island of Kauai. And for a lot of people that don't know this, the biggest hurricane ever to hit the islands of Hawaii was Iniki. And unfortunately, my wife and I lived on the island at that time. It was a destructive hurricane, and so many homes were destroyed. And at that time, I decided to help not only rebuild the islands, but also we established a CERT team, a community emergency response team, to help people. And from that time on, I founded my company called 911 Seminars and decided to teach people how to survive whatever the hurricane, natural disaster might be. And then eventually led into working with schools and churches and businesses on bullying and the active shooter. So I have a program called Connect the Dots. And in the Connecting the Dots program, we try to instill people with the idea that bullying eventually, oftentimes, leads to active shooters. And if you can understand the connection, domestic violence, bullying, and active shooter, you can put it all together and create some kind of a preventive program that will help us as a society counter all of those negative things.
That's very good. And I actually do happen to have some insight doing some video and marketing for an organization similar to yours. And I'm familiar with this idea of taking preventative action, right? Doing threat assessment and understanding what are the signs of someone who may have a proclivity to act out in a certain way. And how do you address that before it ever becomes a huge problem? Is that similar to what you do?
Well, in many ways, and oftentimes in my book, Active Shooter Threats in Our Schools, there are ways to predict the kinds of behavior that will lead to certain things. And if you study active shooter, according to all the FBI reports over the years, over the past 20 years, it's usually going to be a male. It's usually going to be a child that was bullied. And so oftentimes, because of that association, that was my emphasis in trying to get schools to understand you need to start preventing bullying now. A lot of people have a misconception about bullying. They don't understand that bullying can start in preschool. It can start in middle school and amplify, and that's actually the worst age group for bullying. And then as they get into high school, they can start to phase out. The unfortunate part about bullying is, and that's part of my book, is that we have now entered a realm where people that we thought were supposed to be the protectors of our kids are now becoming henchmen or bullies themselves. And that's what my goal is to try and point those things out. We're not approaching things in a common sense way. So I know you often hear people say and use the phrase common sense. And what do they mean? They don't know. So oftentimes in my workshop, I ask people, what does common sense mean? And they actually respond after thinking quite a while, well, it's supposed to be something everybody knows. Unfortunately, we don't, especially these days. And so I have a program called Common Sense Forums, where we have the formula for common sense, and we try to instill upon people, follow the formula. In order to achieve common sense, you have to teach your children. They're not inherited. It's not inherited. So our young kids, according to many of the teachers I work with, they thank me because they have told these parents, you have to teach your children common sense. Don't expect them to know it. And that's how we proceed. We try to instill upon our parents that they have to instill into their children how to have common sense. And we have the formula, IQ, EQ, VR, and EX. And what it stands for is IQ, you use data and facts. EQ, you talk about stories and you impress upon these children through emotional things like music and so forth, how to understand the world. VR, we all learn through video and watching things, our virtual reality. But the most important thing that parents need to understand is it's hands-on experience. That's what we need to teach our children, hands-on experience.
That's really good. That's really good. And before we get even too far, I want to actually read the full description of your book for our listening and our viewing audience as we continue to talk about this. So the title of this book is Who is the Biggest Bully of All? Our schools are the focal point of our neighborhoods. Our schools are not just brick and mortar buildings where we send our children to learn. They are also serve as shelters for the community in a hurricane or a flash flood. They double as centers for adult education, community programs, musical productions, athletic and robotic tournaments, proms, and graduations. There is no other location that has served so many people over so many generations. We even vote in person at our neighborhood school. No matter what your age, race, sex, religion, or political persuasion, we are all vested in our neighborhood schools. So why are some schools hiding things from parents? Why are the bureaucrats who are supposed to protect our children turning from protectors into bullies? That's a pretty powerful and provocative question. Who is your book aimed at? Who is your reader? And what has been the response from the readers of your book? What does that look like?
Oh, thank you for asking, Joseph. Basically, because I work with so many schools, the schools are welcoming the book. And the reason for that is so many of the schools I work with, when the pandemic first came about, many of the schools asked me to make presentations, me and my colleagues, about the pandemic, because they knew that I had done things before on the bird flu. So before lockdowns came out, we were already reaching out to schools who had parent forums and workshops for us to explain to them. And our whole theory is this: with education, you can reduce fear. So parents were concerned about it, and they wanted to find out more about it. And the schools are the main focus of where parents will go to get information. And this was the beautiful thing about it. We were doing workshops at the schools. Unfortunately, when the lockdowns came, and I call them the lockouts, because a lot of schools were so fearful, they actually closed down completely. Not all, many stayed open. And they then asked us to come in and advise them on how best to make the parents feel safe with their children coming into campus. And our whole program is this: every school campus is unique. So you cannot treat in one swoop of a mandate, this is what every school should do. So our advice was to the school. Administration, teachers, and parents get together. Find out what is your approach to being safe and having all of your children come to school, or create a hybrid system. So for those who didn't want to bring their kids, you could do some on campus, some on video. Whatever the case, there's never, and this is what we always try to emphasize, you should never have an either or program. You should never say, this is it, this is the only way. You should always give options. You should always talk with parents and advise them, these are the choices, and this is what we can do. That's the best way, I believe, to make everybody feel comfortable. But they need to get information to reduce the fear.
That's great. That's great. And you also use the phrase, education reduces fear. And I think that's a really good reminder and really good phrase. I also like what you said about the fact that one sweeping mandate should not necessarily dictate what everybody's doing. And I think that that's really powerful as well. I think that it's a bit arrogant for any one organization, whether it be the government or whoever, to say, hey, this is what's true for all of society. You know, that's simply not the way the world has worked since the beginning of time. So I'm glad that you're bold enough. And I'm almost surprised that you're being embraced by the schools. How have you navigated that? What approach has been successful for you entering into those conversations with school districts?
Well, in many cases, we deal with charter schools, we deal with private schools, and we deal with all types of schools. Now, you have to understand, in the state of Hawaii, public schools are under one school district. On the mainland, they don't understand that. There are so many different districts throughout the state, and every district does their own thing. In the state of Hawaii, we have one district, and we always try to make sure that every administration that we talk to always follows their rules. They have to follow their rules. But within their rules and within what the guidelines are, there are always exceptions. And I'll give you some examples. There were some schools that were concerned because they were told that they shouldn't have their children without masks. And so we designed a program, okay, if they have to wear masks, where do they have to wear it? Inside, outside. So then in working with schools, many of them designed their schedules so that the classes that used to be indoors were all outdoors now. Now, when the children are outdoors, there's a more relaxed feeling about it. And the parents and the teachers were really comfortable with that. When the kids are outside and they're separated in certain groups, then they don't have to wear the masks. We also advise them that there are some important things they should understand. You never put a mask on a child that's 2 years or younger. And the rule behind that and the guidelines are always this. If a child cannot remove a mask by itself, it's dangerous to put a mask on and leave that child alone. So these are the kinds of things we pointed out. And many of our schools followed some of our suggestions about scheduling, making as many classes outdoors, dividing the classes into smaller groups, and doing everything they could to, within the structure, separating the desks, moving them at a different distance, directing them to different directions. All these kinds of things helped keep the schools so that their children and their parents felt comfortable bringing them on campus. And that was the idea behind it.
That's very good. That's very, very insightful. When you were in the process of writing this particular book, what was an aha moment that you had? Something that surprised you as you were writing, thinking, preparing all of your content, doing your research? What would you describe? What's an aha moment that you might have had?
Okay, that's very good, because I always like to think in many of my writings and workshops, we always try to impress upon people who are in charge of something, people who are supposed to be leaders. They have to have that aha moment of inspiration that tells them the best way to do something is following advice, using your common sense, but also having some kind of a vision, a different perspective, a change, and that's the aha moment. And when I was putting the books together, there's 3 volumes. The first one is out. There are 2 to follow, and they're coming out next year. But the most important thing I came to realize is this. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of intelligent disobedience, but every leader needs to teach that. We need a culture of bringing our children up to understand this. It's called intelligent disobedience by a fellow named Ira Caleff. And the idea behind that is that sometimes we know deep down inside, we know in our conscience that what we are told to be doing, what we are told to do, doesn't make any sense. And sometimes it isn't that it doesn't make any sense, it's wrong and it's harmful. And when it reaches that point, we have to follow the intelligent disobedience format. And that is, first of all, if somebody in authority that you usually respect and you always follow their lead starts talking to you and telling you something to do that you know is wrong, and we teach children this, the first thing you need to do is blink and think about it. Did they really ask me to do that? Are they really saying that? And once you come to the conclusion that that is exactly what they want you to do, then you have to make a choice. And when you make that choice, you have to be vocal about it. So it's called blink, think, choice, and voice. When you have the choice that you make, that you want to do the right thing, then you have to make that voice in yourself say, no, I will not do it. It's wrong. And this is what we train people to do. Or actually, there's a program for canines. We teach canine dogs that they need to understand when they're taking their leader, their handler, their protector, that they have to prevent them from doing wrong. So there's a story about a guy that went to an elevator with a seeing eye dog. He's a blind man, standing in front of the elevator, and the elevator door opens. And immediately the canine dog steps in front of his owner and will not let him pass. Spectators seeing this are thankful because they see that the elevator door did not arrive safely and there would have been a drop. So the canine actually saved his owner's life by disobeying his command. The command was take me to the elevator, and he wouldn't do it. Well, that's what we have to learn too as people. And so that's my aha moment. Who's the biggest bully of all? If we have authority figures telling us to do certain things that are wrong, we need to disobey. Okay.
Wow. Very insightful. Very, very good. Very provocative in a good way, provoking some very good thinking. And I like that term, intelligent disobedience. I'm going to remember that. And I'm going to steal it. I'll quote you one time, but then I'm going to steal it. So,
Okay.
So tell us a little bit more about how people could get a hold of you if they're intrigued by your book and also some of the services that you also provide. Where is the best place for people to go?
Okay, they can contact me through Leadership Books or my website, and it's 911seminars.com, or my website, ajlactaoen.com. And on those websites, they have email, telephone, however they want to do it. We welcome people to touch bases with us. We have a lot of other programs that were coming up now because I especially deal with schools. We have a program now that I call CRT, and it's not critical race theory. This is the Charitable Remainder Trust. And the power of the Charitable Remainder Trust is something that a lot of people don't know. There's some hidden benefits there that can help schools. And so that's another program I'm working on.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I love the space that you work in. I really appreciate your passion, your mission. I love your life story and even your experience, which must have been very extreme when you were on the island experiencing that hurricane. But out of that traumatic experience, what you've built is pretty incredible. And so I hope that that's an inspiration for our listeners and our viewers, that we can take our experiences, use it for good, and then to even train and inspire others. That's very powerful. So thank you for that. Thank you for being a guest today. Thank you for joining us today for the Compendium Podcast hosted by Leadership Books. You can, if you're watching or listening today, you can visit us online at leadershipbooks.com. Please check out AJ's website as well, 911seminars.com. And we will catch all of you in the next episode. Thank you again, AJ.
Thank you, Joseph. Aloha.
Thank you for joining us for today's broadcast. I do hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And be sure to visit us online at leadershipbooks.store. There you'll find the works of some of the finest thought leaders today. And be sure to tune in here each week to gain even deeper insights from one of those leaders on the Compendium Podcast.